Welcome back to ThinkTech. I'm Jay Fidell. This is Global Connections. We're talking about China and the U.S.-China tensions right now with Carl Baker. How can we tell who's winning in this competition? Is it a competition? Carl Baker is Senior Advisor at Pacific Forum. He helps us understand the tensions, developing tensions between the U.S. and China, including the DoD's new expansion into the Philippines, on top of the Quad, so to speak. The Chinese surveillance balloon, and that's balloons with a plural, the cancellation of Anthony Blinken's diplomatic visit, which is interesting, and if not threatening. Are we moving beyond tariffs? Remember them? That's a word we haven't heard in a while. Beyond tariffs toward a new Cold War. Are we in there already? What does this mean to the U.S. and to China and to all of us? We'll be right back. Welcome to the show, Carl Baker. It's nice to see you.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. Well, good to be back.
So, you follow China and U.S. relations, and certainly there is a lot. You know, they're in the kind of the shadow of Ukraine, and they're in the certainly in the shadow of the dysfunction of the American government, of course. But we have to keep our eye on them. We have to watch them because they're connected to us, whether we like it or not. Connected economically, connected in terms of competition, in Asia. So what are your current thoughts about that? We seem to have a lot of tension, no?
Well, we do. I think that certainly, there was a little bit of a ray of hope, I guess, at the G20 in Bali, where President Biden and Xi had sort of thought that they were going to get back together. Obviously, Secretary of State Blinken was going to make a visit. There was talk about some ways to reduce the tensions. And then, of course, we had this balloon incident, which has turned out to be a very visual demonstration of the perceived threat from Chinese spying and intelligence gathering on the United States, which, sort of has allowed the American public a kind of a firsthand view of the ratcheting up of tensions, I think.
Yeah, let's talk about that. This has been going on for a while. It's not a surprise that the Chinese have a technology to get a balloon up that high and load it with that much surveillance equipment, very high-tech, sensitive equipment, and they can do it at 50, 60,000 feet above where jetliners fly. And it's also, pretty clear that the U.S. has radar and other instruments that can tell it's up there. It's big. The thing is the size of a couple of VW buses, the size of a Greyhound. And, inside, you can imagine how much electronics were packed inside, and come to find that we knew about it as it entered American airspace from the West. And we watched it, at least, theoretically watched it across the country. And the newspapers said that it was too threatening to shoot it down because it might come and hit somebody. I find that an interesting piece of propaganda. Forgive me for the use of that word. And we only shot it down when it got over the Atlantic. There's many questions that come to mind about, how come the public was not advised of this earlier? The government knew about it earlier. Wouldn't it have been useful to tell people about it earlier? So, your thoughts about whether the government has been transparent with us, and whether the government has been candid with us, and whether Joe Biden is holding back, and whether it is a legitimate excuse to say we didn't want to drop this in a cornfield.
Well, I mean, yeah, there's a lot to unpack there of what you said, because you're sort of rehearsing the news to me here, and the fact is that we really don't even know what was in this particular balloon yet, or in the basket underneath the balloon, if you will.
I saw one fantastic cartoon. Actually, it was a photograph of this balloon, big balloon in the sky, and then there's a thread, a line going down. If your eyes follow it, and at the bottom was a little cardboard box of Chinese takeout. So I feel certain, Carl, that there was no Chinese takeout in the bus.
You're probably right. But I mean, more to the point I wanted to make is this started out as this may be a spy balloon. And within a matter of 3 days, it's become a supply balloon. We know it was packed full of very highly technical, sensitive instrumentation to intercept whatever it was intercepting in terms of communications. And it might have had optical sensors on it. And the Congress has already voted unanimously that this was an outrageous, egregious infringement on U.S. sovereignty. And so, but then when you read the rest of the story, is what we've collected so far is stuff that's been floating on the surface, which is really just the balloon infrastructure itself and a few wires. But everything else is still being dug out of the bottom of the ocean. So, obviously the United States has gotten ahead of itself here in proclaiming that this was really an egregious violation of our sovereignty and that it was a spy satellite. Now, or a spy balloon. Now, I'm certain that it is. I mean, there's enough other evidence that they took, from the U-2, which was flying above it, that peeked inside and saw some of the equipment that was in there. So some of what you're saying is true, but we have to be careful that there's hyperbole on both sides at this point. The Chinese are sticking to their story. This was just a weather balloon that's straight off course, and it did sort of follow the pattern of the jet stream. So there's some plausible deniability that it really did lose control of this thing, and that's why it ended up coming up over the continental U.S. And then the United States, of course, has come back and said, yeah, but it loitered over Malmstrom Air Force Base, and so there's obviously two sides to the story. But what point I'm trying to make here is that we've gotten to the point now where it almost doesn't matter what we find in the debris, because we've already decided what it was and what it did without a lot of hard evidence. And the Chinese appear to be sticking to their story. And so now it's really becomes a matter of competing narratives and how much do you want to reveal. And I found what's interesting is this whole business about this has happened before. This is a recurring problem. The Chinese have balloons all over the world that are doing this. And so, I mean, that gets to your questions about, is the United States being transparent? And it's a recurring thing that happened with Ukraine, if you remember, where the United States started giving out intelligence to make its case for what was happening. And I see the same thing here again. It's revealing what was classified information about our knowledge of Chinese spying using these balloons. So I think that's sort of an interesting way that the United States has developed to counter these narratives, these disinformation narratives, if you will. And I think this is some sort of the new world that we're living in. So to say that the United States was dishonest, I don't think that's a very useful way to characterize it. I think that what we're seeing the intelligence, and there was no reason to reveal this intelligence prior to now.
Really? Now I mean, wouldn't it have been better to tell people what was going on when they first learned? What would be the downside of that?
Well, because there's no hard evidence. In other words, now that they have something that should reveal what was really happening, and people see it, now you have to reveal this because you can't keep it quiet anymore because people have had the visual experience. So that's why I think you have to sort of open it up.
In terms of the diplomatic relations between our two countries, it seems to me this is not constructive. To allow it to be exaggerated this way, to allow it to go to our fears. Wouldn't it have been better to handle it some other way? I think the result is that people are excited about China. They're angry at China. The Republicans have something to complain about, with respect to Biden's handling of it. I think the relationship that he hoped to achieve in Singapore really has gone by the wayside now. because of the aggravation that has come out of this. Query in general, Carl,
Yeah.
was this well handled?
Well, no, it wasn't. I don't think it was. But I think, again, there's always this balance that you have to find between intelligence and transparency. And I think that this is a case where you can withhold information for so long, and then when it becomes obvious, then you have to be transparent. And so, no, it wasn't handled in a very sophisticated way, I don't think, on either side. I mean, I think, if the Chinese would have been more cooperative up front, we may have been able to avoid it. Where bring it down, if it was really a weather satellite, I'm sure they would have said, well, let's bring it down over Alaska, and you can take a look inside and see that it was a weather balloon. So they weren't particularly helpful in what they did, but the United States was put in a position where they have to do something because people see it in the air. So now, how are you going to reveal this information? So it's no, it wasn't handled very well, and it has hurt the relationship. But you also have to give some credit to the current administration in Washington that they handled it probably the best way they could, given that they hadn't done so earlier, that they hadn't made any reference to these balloons before. Because ultimately, the balloon itself is it's sort of bizarre, what they were actually trying to collect that couldn't be collected from low Earth orbit satellites. And we all accept them as being legitimate instruments of national intelligence.
Let me offer you a reflection. The administration's statement that they didn't want to hurt anybody by blowing it out of the air while it was over the continent really, is questionable to me, in the sense that you could find areas for hundreds of miles where there's nothing, no city, no town, nothing, no infrastructure. And here's the thing: if the administration shut it down over some cornfield, in the middle of nowhere, we would have all the parts. We would know exactly what was on that thing, right?
I wouldn't be quite so confident about that. That you can actually bring something. Maybe out in the middle of Alaska you could bring it down. But if I was reading an account of the airplane. There's released today on one of the news sites was the actual interaction between the pilots that shot it down. And as it went into the ocean, they were talking about a debris field that was fairly extensive that had floated down with this thing. And so I think, coming from a place where they have a lot of cornfields, I'm not so sure that is really true, that you could have gotten it down inside a specific cornfield. Maybe, like you say, maybe out in the hinterlands of Alaska, but once you get past there, I'm a little skeptical about your quick dismissal of people who live by cornfields.
Well, what's interesting is the government, the administration, may have felt that there was something explosive inside, defensively explosive, and they didn't want to bring it down anywhere where anybody get hurt from the explosion. Likewise, you mentioned control of this thing. Apparently, there were navigational systems on it that could push it this way or that way. I'm not sure how that might have worked, but you can do that with a balloon. And maybe the administration felt that it could be directed over a populated area to do damage. But let me ask you one follow-up question: Are we sitting down? Is this the end of balloons?
Well, that's kind of an interesting question. I guess it really depends on what I mean. As this unfolds, where we're now finding out that China has had a fairly robust spy balloon program, you have to wonder if this is it. Probably not. I mean, they're probably going to continue to do whatever it is they were doing with it. And I certainly, if they do find the debris and then we figure out what it is they were looking at, it's still a question. I mean, the latest I saw was that apparently what the U-2 saw was some sort of radar array that suggests, or some kind of antenna array, I should say, that suggests that it was actually picking up communications. So it was probably listening to your cell phone discussion with your brother last night about what you're going to do for vacation this summer. I mean, so I mean, it's just hard, really kind of hard to tell. It's hard to believe that they were using it for optics simply because low Earth orbit satellites do a much better job of that sort of thing. And so it probably was some sort of signals intelligence that they were trying to look at. And then the other thing, there's so many questions about what really happened here and what happened in the past, and what China was really doing with these satellites, because they've said now that they've been here before, and we don't know where they were. Were they actually just over Alaska? They just kind of crept into U.S. territory to do a little probing of our capabilities, or were they actually coming over the mainland continental U.S.? We just don't know all the details of what this program actually entailed, I think.
To go a little further on my question about whether this is the end of balloons, it strikes me just talking with you that it may be the beginning of balloons. Mm-hmm. We may face a world where there are balloons everywhere by everybody. Now that we've had this experience with China,
that we learn what they can actually do with those balloons. Yeah. I mean, they're certainly cheaper to operate than the U-2. And basically they're not that much. I mean, the ceiling for a U-2 is 80,000 or so, and so that's the balloon is up in that range, and so I'm sure they're cheaper to operate than a U-2.
This on top of remarks and articles suggesting that China is very sophisticated at hacking, very sophisticated at hacking and affecting our social media and thus our politics. This on top of our move to build the Quad there in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands and so forth, and our most recent move in the Philippines to establish a network of bases there. All very interesting because we're being fairly aggressive. It's hard to say whether we're being aggressive in response to something or all on our own, as a sort of preemptive strike. What does it look like our policy is these days in terms of building the Quad and building a network of bases in the Philippines?
Well, it's more than just the Quad. There's there's AUKUS, there's the Japan, Australia, U.S. trilat. There's all these other activities that we're trying to do with the Philippines, with Japan, building up the defenses for both of those countries, and certainly trying to convince the rest of Southeast Asia that China is a threat with its territorial claims in the South China Sea, its aggressive support for fishermen and trying to claim resources in that area. So, I think that clearly the United States sees its role as trying to deter what it sees as a very aggressive China and trying to preempt Chinese dominance in that part of the world. So I think that's ultimately the intent of the United States. Now, is it being overly aggressive in doing that? Is China really a threat? I think not all the people in Southeast Asia are convinced it is. That when you talk to the people from Southeast Asia, they say, but we really don't want to choose. We really kind of want to keep taking advantage of this competition, much like we did, for all these decades, where we take the advantages from having a robust economic relationship with China, and we'd like to have the United States there in case something goes wrong, that then the United States can confront China's Navy or China's Coast Guard as they try to take resources out of the South China Sea. So they want both sides. They want to play both sides here, and so I think that the United States is in a very difficult position. They're trying to convince the world that China is a threat, yet the rest of the world and the United States, for that matter, really benefit from the economic catalyst that China has become.
Yeah, so interesting. There's a very interesting article by Tim Snyder. He has a newsletter. He sent it out yesterday. And it talks about Putin mostly, but it talks about how you can have a sort of an anti-nuclear threat strategy, a strategy to deal with Putin's threats of nuclear war. And one of the elements, this is a very interesting article, and one of the elements in this examination, this analysis of what to do as against those threats, is don't be provoked. don't get too excited about it, because that's what he wants. That's part of the reason he makes the threat. And I suppose you could take the same approach, the same analysis for China. China makes these statements, about Taiwan and how it wants Taiwan, and one of these days going to take Taiwan, and then everybody reacts as if it were a nuclear threat. And I wonder what your thought is and how we should properly react to these threats that China makes.
Well, again, the the threats that China is making are not military threats. The Chinese really are not in the business of making military threats. They're simply building their military capabilities to provide them with what they consider a commensurate military capability to go along with their expanded economic capabilities. And so, the whole threat to Taiwan is the only thing the Chinese ever really say about Taiwan is that we reserve the right to use military force if the separatists in Taiwan move to become independent. They're very careful. So when you talk about the threats they make to Taiwan, they're not as blatant and as aggressive as the Americans make it sound. Again, this is this. I see so much of this as competing narratives between the United States and China. So I think you have to be very careful when you make your statement about the aggression of China, because China isn't doing it. It's as much the United States sort of hyperbolizing that threat to make it look like China is saying these things and that they're becoming a real immediate
Yeah,
existential
you make
threat.
it real when you raise the ante that way,
Right.
and it looks like we are doing that. The rhetoric is unnecessarily hot here,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
is that good policy? Because I agree with you. China's rhetoric is not all that hot, but the American rhetoric, heats up everything, and before you know it, we have a Cold War.
Yeah, well, yeah, the whole Cold War. I mean, yeah, I understand why people want to use the whole idea of the Cold War, but you have to appreciate how much more integrated economically the world is. I mean, after decades of globalization, I was just talking earlier. I mean, the numbers for last year came out. China is still the United States' largest trading partner. We still have a 400 or $500 billion trade deficit with China. We're hooked on cheap Chinese goods. Don't kid yourself. And if you want to see inflation in the United States, just try to push those tariffs that are still in place, by the way, even higher, or trying to actually decouple these economies, and you'll find out what inflation really looks like when you have to start building everything in California.
But let me look at the flip side of this. Suppose we took off those tariffs, and it wasn't helpful when Trump put them in. They're not helpful now. They raised the temperature,
Well, they
and
raise the prices.
they raised the prices, and they hurt American producers and so forth. All bad reasons to have the tariffs come up this way. Suppose we took them off, and we made a deal with Xi about, let's be cool about this. And we maybe slowed down a little on the bases in the Philippines, and we maybe slowed down about all these other, mutual defense arrangements, or arrangements that could turn into mutual defense arrangements all around, the circumference of China. And we tried to recapture, the Gemütlichkeit that we had in the aught years with China, and we're going to do business with China, and we're going to tolerate some of their machinations, but basically, we're not going to provoke them. Wouldn't that be a good policy now?
Well, in my view, yes. But I think what we've done is we've gotten ourselves to the point where we can't really do that again. I mean, we've sort of closed those doors in many ways because we have to have a threat that we want to deter, and China has become that threat. And so if you try to go back, I think then first of all you have a domestic problem because there's a group of people who will immediately say we're demonstrating weakness. Just as you saw with the balloon incident, when we didn't shoot it down over Alaska, then we were demonstrating weakness. I mean, those were specific words used by the people who were opposing the idea of letting it float through the continental United States before shooting it down. So you have the domestic problem, but you also have this fear on the part of Americans, and how real it is kind of hard to quantify. That if we do that, then other countries in Asia are going to say, "Oh, the United States is getting weak." This whole mindset of deterrence permeates everything. Where if you show any weakness, then you're going to not be able to deter this existential threat that you see, because China is there, it's real, it has a military capability, and how can you possibly say that you're going to not react to that? So we've built ourselves into a position where we don't really have that option to say, okay, let's try again, and go back, go backward.
Really too bad that Joe Biden did not include more of this, sort of set the stage for better times in his State of the Union. Likewise, he didn't talk all that much about Ukraine and supporting Ukraine. So I think that's a function of, the dysfunction in our government, that he would be attacked if he spent too much time and money dealing with those things. But I guess I worry about the fact that it's not going well. And one thing I want to ask you about is Japan. You say these countries they want to see a strong America and so forth. And well, I read recently that Japan is increasing its weapons and its military systems, and for all the world to see. And that's obviously because of China, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Japan is very much on board with this idea that China is becoming an existential threat. They've agreed to increase their defense budget significantly. They're building weapons that go well beyond the confines of the old Article 9 restrictions on self-defense. And I mean, South Korea is the same way. South Korea is for not so much because of China, but because of what's happening in North Korea. Which again is a byproduct. The success of North Korea is something of a byproduct of the conflict between the United States and China, because they can no longer work together to sort of constrain North Korean nuclear ambitions. That whole part of the equation is sort of gone too. It used to be that the Americans, and rightly so, I think, thought that the United States and China could actually work together to constrain North Korea. That notion is gone. So so South Korea, Japan, and even the Philippines, recognizes that there is a potential problem, there is a potential threat, and so they want to have the United States, which is still the preeminent military power in the region, to provide some reassurances.
Yeah. So, looking at the economy side of things, Joe Biden made comments about how the Chinese economy is not doing as well as she wanted it to do, and then you wonder, how all of that interacts with this geopolitical tension, and also how it interacts with the Belt Road Initiative, which is still very important initiative, at least theoretically. So, how is the economy doing as far as you can see, and what are the effects of any decline in growth?
Well, I mean, their GDP is now somewhere, depends on which one you look at, somewhere between 3% and 5%. So, it's coming closer and closer to what a mature, developed economy would look like. And I mean, it certainly isn't out of the woods yet on their COVID policy. They're still recovering from the really tragic way they handled the zero COVID policy, and then suddenly they didn't. And there were. We don't really know how many people died, but it certainly was a rather traumatic event. I mean, they've got they still have their real estate bubble that hasn't gone away. They've got a lot of bad debt sitting out there. They've got a lot of vacant apartment buildings that aren't ever probably going to be occupied. So they've got that. They've got they've still trying to repair their relationship with the large tech companies that they sort of eviscerated in some ways by not allowing them to be entrepreneurial, So yeah, they've got a lot of problems internally, but they've also got problems internationally. If you've watched Janet Yellen make a little visit to Zambia, Zambia has become sort of the poster child here because they're in debt and they want to try to restructure the loans, and the Chinese are being stubborn. They don't want to restructure the loans, so China is starting to feel the effects of this global development initiative that they took, and yeah, I mean, just like the Americans, just like the Europeans discovered, Africa can be a real problem when it comes trying to restructure debt, and you have to kind of give in, and China's being really stubborn about it. So this is a problem, and so they're exposed there. They're exposed with the Indians and the Americans are looking at arms sales to India, which ultimately becomes a threat to China. There's as you say, the Philippine bases are kind of a problem for China because they see themselves losing influence in the Philippines. Yeah, China has its problems, and it has to deal with those. And the question is can the United States really allow them to do that, or do they feel the need to kind of keep pushing them, with the sanctions and the tariffs on semiconductors, trying to prevent them from getting technology and all that. It's yeah, the economic side is difficult for China. They certainly still have a very robust trade relationship with everybody in the region, the United States and in Europe. But yeah, they're struggling trying to get beyond the infrastructure driven development that they had for the years where they were doing 8 to 10% GDP growth. But that was, as we know, that was driven by an infrastructure drive, and they tried to export that through the Belt and Road, and that's not working out real well. There's a lot of projects that have been canceled. There's a lot of bad debt that was created, and they're finding out that while the United States talks about debt trap diplomacy, the fact is that the Chinese are strapped with some debt that's going to have to get restructured at some point.
Yeah, and they were looking for investments into Belt Road by countries other than China, by investors, all around the world. And I imagine what's happened with Belt Road is probably going to deter further investment in Belt Road by capital organizations outside of China, don't you think?
Yeah, I do. In fact, it's kind of interesting because what you see with China, you remember there were two aspects. There was the Belt and Road Initiative, and then there was the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. And AIIB really sort of followed the model of the multilateral banks, and they've been much better with their loans. They've been much better with multilateralizing the loans and collateralizing the loans. And that's actually working out where there's some benefit that's being derived from that, and the loans are much more solid. The projects are much more grounded in reality than the Belt and Road, where there tended to be whatever dictator X wanted, like a big sports stadium or some palace that was completely useless for industrial or commercial purposes. So I think that they've certainly learned, but again, Belt and Road is in some ways a failure because it was ultimately an economic development scheme that they thought people were going to buy into and that everything would be fine. But they've come to realize it's not. But it was always very unilateral.
Yeah, it strikes me that China has lost a certain amount of what do you want to call it, goodwill around the world.
Yeah.
And some of the things you're describing are a direct relation or connected in some way. In many ways, the moves that she has made in the past few years, and I'm including, the Uyghurs, I'm including Hong Kong, and various other, peripheral areas and arguments and oppressions that you have to lay at his doorstep. He's gone from the Gemütlichkeit of the Aught years, I call it, to a kind of pariah status, and also supporting, to a certain extent, maybe that's diminishing now, supporting Vladimir Putin and the adventure in Ukraine and so forth. He's become more of a pariah. And my suggestion to you, I'm really interested in your thought about this, is pariahs don't do well economically. because people don't want to get too close to them. Am I right?
Yeah, I think that's essentially right. Now the question is how do you or can you isolate Putin from the rest of the Chinese society? And I think that's where the big challenge comes, given the way China controls information and basically is in the business of denying transparency, of obliterating any transparency or any attempt at a opposition movement. Can you really separate Xi from China, because he's tried to make them one and the same by focusing on the party and then taking the full party leadership to his own. So I think that's the real challenge that we should be looking at, rather than trying to think about all these deterrence moves and spending a lot of money on building up defense. We should be looking at how do you effectively convince the Chinese that there's a better future for them, absent someone who's accumulating power for his own end.
And that is a true statement. There is a better future for them.
Yeah.
Because, and there's a better future for us. I mean, we have people in Congress now that want to cut off, the technology, don't want to do any technology trading with China, isolate from China. This is not necessarily a good thing. We should go the other way. We should find a way to collaborate. We have bigger problems, existential problems to deal with. It'd be so much better if the two countries collaborate.
Yeah, I've made that argument so many times that I feel like I'm a voice in the wilderness on it.
Not with me, Carl.
Okay, good. Well, I'm going from cornfields to wilderness here, so but I mean, the point is that we should be able to do what she is doing better, because we have a better reputation, and we should be willing to take some risks in terms of giving other countries the benefit of the doubt that they don't need our protection as much as we need them to collaborate to make the world a better place and start dealing with some of the existential issues that are really important, like the climate change and development that sustains everybody and not just a few.
What I find interesting, and what I would like to close with you on, is artificial intelligence. 20 years ago, China didn't know what it was, and we did a little bit. Now we know more, but they probably know more than we know, or at least it's a head-to-head competition.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at the was it the GPT, ChatGPT, and all of these programs, it's not just ChatGPT. It's dozens and dozens of companies competing all over the world to get ahead on AI, and that includes China, which has a firm basis of experience and competence in this area. So I suggest to you that the world is going to change with AI, and that would include China and the U.S., and it would include everything you could think of. So do you have any thoughts yet? If you don't, we'll have another show about it, about how AI is going to change the calculus of international relations, and specifically the calculus of our tech versus their tech.
No. I guess I should be honest and say that I don't have a real good sense of how AI changes the world. I mean, having poked around a little bit with Chat GPT, you can see its limitations. I mean, it clearly it might get you past the medical exam, but I wouldn't feel real confident in relying on it a lot in how we deal with international relations just yet. It may come up with answers we don't like, and they may not be correct. But I mean, it's not just AI. I mean, it's quantum technology. When you start thinking about what if it really is beyond ones and zeros? How do you comprehend that, and what impact does that really have on our ability to create this artificial intelligence that we sort of see a little bit in this whole AI? And so the world is going to change. And how long do we rely on these diesel powered, jet fuel powered weapons of war to settle our disagreements and begin to realize that it's really an information society, and that it's all about narratives, and that we controlling the narrative is where the real challenge is. And that's why this balloon incident is so interesting, I think, because the balloon is simply a old technology that we've turned into something, and we have these competing narratives out there saying, well, it really is important. It's a dramatic step, and it's a violation of our territorial sovereignty, and yet it's a balloon. And what is it doing? It's picking up signals from your cell phone. Is that really significant, or is this new technology that's changing how the world works and thinks and interacts is that what matters? I think it is. I don't know if I answered your. I don't think I answered your question.
You did, but you also suggested to me that we have to do this again. We have to follow this, and I would like to do that with you on a periodic basis so that we can track on what's happening and how these things are playing out, and how your views are changing, and how you feel these things are changing our lives. Carl Baker, Senior Advisor, Pacific Forum. Thank you so much for joining us today, Carl.
Thank you.
Aloha.
Thank you so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, please like us and click the subscribe button on YouTube and the follow button on Vimeo. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and donate to us at thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.